A few more friends joining us here, so why don't we get settled. My name is Jay Hine. I'm president of the Sagamore Institute. What a delight it is to welcome you to our building and to welcome you to Mr. Levy's neighborhood. So Louis Levy was a printer from southern Indiana, from Madison. You may know his story. If you don't, I want to give it a bit of a framing because it's an inspiration we're using for today. Louis Levy was a printer. The old Nordstrom's building, for those of you that remember where it was in the mall, you'll see Levy Brothers scrolled across the top of that building. That whole block was the Levy Brothers print shop. He commissioned this mansion to be built in 1905. I don't know how long it took to build it. I bet a few years. And he had a remarkable set of friends, and that's who we're going to celebrate today. As a matter of fact, if you look at the time period between the Civil War and our state centennial in 1916, we had arguably the best 50 years of leadership in our state's history. You know many of these names individually. I suspect you haven't spent a lot of time thinking collectively about who they were. It may be a good parlor game, too, to see if the last 50 were better than that 50, because I think it'd be a really terrific competition, and we have a number of those leaders in the room today. But when you look at this game day program, we refer to it as, I am offering lunch for any one of you who can read this program, start to finish, and not say at least 5 times, I had no idea, because it is stunning. As a matter of fact, the talent was so extraordinary and rich, we had to put them in categories, from statesmen to industrialists to arts and letters. Just a remarkable assembly of talent. And I wanted us, as part of the 3rd annual Indiana Conference on Citizenship, to contemplate who they were and how, as citizens, they helped build the cities they lived in and the state that we enjoy. We stand on their shoulders, of course. Maybe also to contemplate what it meant to be contemporaries. So Mr. Levy's neighborhood had a president and a vice president and these remarkable literary giants. And it's probably tempting to look back at them with a halo and to see their enormous contribution, as we should. But they probably had a few rivalries among them. They probably had a few stumbles that are also good for us to contemplate as well and to be inspired by as we think about the challenges that our nation faces, the uncivil discourse that is too often a part of what we see on the news or in the public square. Indiana has a lot to offer, and it always has, to enliven the debate, to educate the debate, but also just to roll up sleeves and to build better neighborhoods and to create jobs and to build a better society. That's a big reason why the Sagamore Institute exists. I want to acknowledge at least 3 board members. I see Doug Wilson, our chairman, and Dayton Mullendorp, our vice chairman, Chris Lowry, board member. If I'm missing any, please raise your hand. We have many dignitaries among us, too many for me to work through a list. You all are. That's the point of this gathering. The American founders believed that citizens would be at the center of the American experiment. And when Benjamin Franklin left Constitutional Hall, and if the story is true, and the woman asked him, what kind of government did you give us? And he said, a republic if you keep it, ma'am, is our assignment today. What does it mean to keep the republic, to enrich the republic? Well, we know it means a couple of things, at least. We need to be really well educated on the issues of the day, but also the duties of citizenship. And we need to be highly engaged in the affairs of society. We don't just elect those who build and fix. We perform those duties ourselves, always have, and it's the American idea centers on it. But that has to be renewed generation after generation, and again, that's why we're gathered here. We want to celebrate the citizens of the Civil War era leading through the birth of the last century. You're going to hear 3 phenomenal speakers who I apologize are going to have tough acts to follow because some of you have already heard from Abraham Lincoln and Benjamin Harrison, and Railroad Dan may have been the best of the bunch in terms of entertainment, and so the bar's been set high, but these gentlemen will not disappoint. We're going to treat it a bit like Benjamin Harrison's front porch. I'm just going to introduce them very briefly because you already know them, I'm sure. Their bios are in the program, but I'm just going to introduce them each sort of at a top-line narrative now, and then they can just follow each other. First Charlie Hyde, then John Mutz, and Mike Murphy, and then John Mutz can be our anchor here. Charlie Hyde is President and CEO of the Benjamin Harrison Home, the terrific mission to become the most civically engaged presidential site in America. I hope you all participate in their mission. Mike Murphy wrote a terrific book he's going to tell you about, which will give us a peek into the Civil War era on how we were a state divided in many respects, and what it took for us to persevere internally, just as our national story was working out this great struggle. And then John Mutz is going to remind us that the arts are just as important as the affairs of state. So we're really privileged to have each of them with us today, and indeed each of you. Thank you very much.
Well, special thanks to the Sagamore Institute and to Jay for inviting me today. I'm honored to speak to such a distinguished audience, and I'm pleased to see so many friends and familiar faces. That said, I'm here today for 3 reasons. 1, to share a story about a singular individual who called Indiana his home and is one of the state's preeminent citizens over the past 2 centuries. 2, to give perspective on what value his story brings to Indiana's 3rd century. And 3, to ask each of you, again, to answer the call of service as fellow citizens for this great state. As citizens of this great state, you're better qualified to help address the challenges that we face today. So, as many of you know, Benjamin Harrison was a leader steeped in the importance of public service and civic virtue. He asserted that an American citizen could not be a good citizen who did not have a hope in his heart. So an American citizen could not be a good citizen who did not have a hope in his heart. Benjamin Harrison is the only president elected from Indiana. And while he died at the turning of the last century in 1901, his influence has persisted in ways large and small. His life, much like his legacy, was about looking back and looking forward. The Harrison family record of personal devotion to the United States is matched by few other families throughout our country's history. His great-grandfather was a governor of Virginia and a signer of the Declaration of Independence. His grandfather was a governor of the Indiana Territory and 9th president of the United States. His father served in the Ohio legislature. But in spite of this illustrious lineage, he was no son of privilege. He worked hard to become a preeminent lawyer, answering Lincoln's call for citizen soldiers, and distinguished himself as a Civil War hero. He's remembered primarily today as a conscientious president, an eminent 19th century statesman. But much can be lost in the retelling of history. The bold and the brash are often drawing more interest than the stalwart and strategic. And here perhaps is an opportunity to revisit Harrison's legacy and his larger influence on our country and our community. Renowned Indiana historian James Madison recently asserted that Harrison's administration is considered to be among the most activist and reform-minded of the 19th century. As 23rd President of the United States, Benjamin Harrison set aside 13 million acres of federal land for conservation, advocated for African American voting rights, celebrated the centennial, initiated the modern two-ocean Navy for national defense, secured pensions for Civil War veterans and their widows, hired the first woman onto White House staff, and called for and signed the Sherman Antitrust Act. He presided over the first billion-dollar federal budget, first adopted the Pledge of Allegiance, admitted 6 states to the Union, and left an indelible mark on American culture. While many of his reform efforts were stymied by an intractable Congress, he is increasingly understood as one of the first modern presidents for a strong ethical stance and foresight. His legacy of leadership has been carried forward to today and has helped shape our local and national consciousness in ways that are positive, compelling, but often unacknowledged. He wasn't a Hoosier by birth, but by choice. And Indiana could not have had any president more closely aligned with its values. In typical Hoosier fashion, he diligently went about his work, doing what was right for the right reasons and never seeking undue recognition. He spent his childhood and youth on his grandfather William Henry Harrison's Ohio farm. During college, he met, courted, and married the charming, vivacious, and exceptional for her day, college-educated Carolyn Scott in 1853. They considered moving to Chicago or staying in Cincinnati, But in 1854, the couple decided their prospects would be best in Indianapolis. A wise choice. Upon arrival here, Harrison found that establishing a law practice was much more difficult than he had anticipated. Harrison's long hours, hard work, and diligence paid off. He was elected to the position of city attorney in 1857 and in 1860 to Supreme Court reporter. By his own account, it was the last political office that he voluntarily sought. On July 1st, 1862, a full year after the bombardment of Fort Sumter, Indiana Governor Oliver P. Morton pledged to aid Lincoln's call for 300,000 new reinforcements. So when Harrison and a friend found themselves in the governor's office on business and were invited to speak privately afterwards, Morton shared the difficulty he was facing in meeting Indiana's quota of troops. After a pronounced pause, Harrison offered, "If I can be of any service, I will go." Understand the significance of the offer that Harrison was making. A young family, a thriving law practice, he held the coveted role of Supreme Court reporter. He was under no obligation to commit. Morton felt that it was asking too much to have Harrison go into the field of battle and offered that they could find somebody else to command the regiment if only Harrison might help raise it. Harrison, however, rejected the idea of asking men to join a regiment and go to war, but staying home himself. Harrison set about the arduous task that very day of raising a regiment. 1,000 men from this community, from our community. More than likely, a few of you have ancestors that answered his call to service. He was given a commission as second lieutenant, and 2 weeks later, he was promoted to captain. While the regiment was completed, Governor Morton gave Harrison the commission of colonel. By August 8, 1862, the newly appointed Colonel Harrison had raised 1,000 recruits for the 70th Indiana. He now had to turn these raw recruits into seasoned troops. By day, he marched and drilled his men. By night, long after taps had sounded, he studied and perfected himself in the tactics of war. Discipline would prove to be one of Harrison's most arduous tasks, but his reputation became that of a strong leader. He earned the respect of his men and did not leave them in battle, once even serving as their battlefield doctor under extenuating circumstances. The men learned that he stood by his word and was always concerned with their well-being. Harrison knew that they would have to be disciplined to survive battle. For Harrison's achievements and personal valor at the battles of Resaca and Peachtree Creek, leading his men from the front as they charged their Confederate opposition and overtook the artillery, he was promoted to brigadier general. Returning to Indianapolis after his service in the Civil War, gratefully returning to Caroline and his 2 young children, reestablishing his law practice through a series of remarkable trials that made his reputation as a lawyer, first locally, then regionally, and then nationally. In 1881, Harrison was elected by the Indiana General Assembly to the U.S. Senate. His service over the next 6 years was exemplary, and his name began to circulate nationally as a serious contender for the presidency. Ironically, during this time, he lost an election for governor and re-election by the General Assembly to a Senate seat. But his larger qualities of integrity, intelligence, and as an orator par excellence had awakened national interest. The breadth and scope of Harrison's thinking was original and highly reform-minded for its day. He held tremendous sway as a person of great individual genius and forethought, and the cadence and incisiveness of his expression was bracing. He received the Republican nomination for the presidency in 1888 as a compromise candidate. Then, even as now, Indiana was a swing state, and Harrison was thought the best challenger for incumbent Grover Cleveland. His campaign for the presidency in 1888 was innovative and on his own terms. He took the unusual step of conducting the campaign almost entirely from Indianapolis as a front porch campaign, and gave 80 speeches extemporaneously to over 300,000 people. First from this very stoop of the front porch you'll see at 13th and Delaware Street today. Harrison did not secure the popular vote, but won the electoral vote. He took office without what our generation might call a clear mandate, but he had big plans that he intended to carry through. The first part of his term was a whirlwind of activity, encompassing expansion of the U.S. Navy, passing the Forest Reserve Act, protecting more than 13 million acres of natural resources, and championing African American rights. A member of Harrison's administration, a young Teddy Roosevelt, carried on this work and many other aspects of the Harrison legacy in his own administration. Harrison was a centennial president, inaugurated 100 years after George Washington, an occasion met with national celebration. At the festivities, he declared, and I quote, "We have come into the serious but always inspiring presence of Washington. He was the incarnation of duty, and he teaches us today this great lesson, that those who would associate their names with events that shall outlive a century only do so by high consecration to duty. Self-seeking has no public observance or anniversary." Harrison took this opportunity to encourage schools and public buildings to fly the American flag, and he endorsed the use of the Pledge of Allegiance, a tradition carried forward to today. He made significant efforts contributing to civil service reform and paid an electoral price for his scruples of making appointments based upon ability, not just as political favors. While receiving the nomination for the 1892 election, it was perhaps no large surprise for Harrison when Cleveland retook the presidency. He felt no loss departing, though, confiding that, quote, "he felt like a man released from prison." I'm sure he was not the first or last president to feel that way. Harrison's return to Indianapolis was bittersweet, but he was determined that Indianapolis would remain his home, saying, and I quote, "I love this city." He occupied himself in resuming his successful law practice and guest lecturing at Stanford, first by bringing that institution to national attention. He was recognized by both parties as a potent political force and even rejected later requests to retake the White House. Benjamin Harrison lived in Indianapolis's golden age and did much to personally help it reach that level of attainment. It is no coincidence that his years in the White House coincided with the blossoming of this city. In April 1897, Benjamin Harrison made a speech to the Indianapolis Commercial Club. In the speech, Harrison boldly asserted that Indianapolis is no mean city, carrying forward the crucial idea that a great community must invest in itself. He said, and I quote, "But the ideal city must have other excellences. It must be a city where people diligently mind their own business and the public business, and do both with a decent regard to the judgment and rights of other men. A city whose citizens are brave and true and generous, and who care for their own." A decade later, Indianapolis Mayor Charles Bookwalter echoed Harrison's no mean city theme. His created core, "I am myself a citizen of no mean city," was first chiseled into the cornerstone of City Hall, and ever since into the hearts of our community. Benjamin Harrison died unexpectedly in 1901 from complications from pneumonia after a short bout with influenza. His funeral was attended by President McKinley and dignitaries from across the country. James Whitcomb Riley wrote his eulogy and was buried in Crown Hill. Efforts were soon underway to build a memorial, culminating in 1908 with the dedication of a statue and monument led by Vice President Charles Fairbanks. On President Harrison's memorial statue just north of the Federal Building in downtown Indianapolis, he was remembered in this way. Quote, "His life exemplified the faith he taught, industry, fidelity, courage, sound statesmanship, and justice through law." As he himself eulogized another famed president, "Great lives do not go out, they go on." The Benjamin Harrison Presidential Site helps carry forward this great civic legacy today with 30,000 visitors annually, 19,000 of them Hoosier schoolchildren. With over 10,000 items in our collection, we are blessed with an abundance of cultural treasures. We know that preserving the home of the 23rd president is as much about saving a landmark and, by extension, the greater memory of an age. But it's also about progress. Even as we're looking back, like Harrison, we're thinking forward. With new initiatives like Future Presidents of America Youth Leadership Camp to innovative special exhibits and thoughtful partnerships with organizations like the Sagamore Institute, the presidential site is pulsing with energy and expectation of great things to come. We recognize we all have the potential to do something extraordinary with this remarkable legacy. It is both a reminder of the importance of service and begs for response. As each of us gives thought to our own service as citizens, and what will be our greatest legacy? Is it sufficient to have done good work, to point only to the past? Or might we find new ways, together, to help bring our state to another golden age, one that our children and children's children will look to for inspiration? As this is, after all, the Indiana Conference on Citizenship, I believe I speak for all of us here today in calling upon each of you, as friends, as neighbors, as citizens, as leaders, as Sagamores, to redouble your efforts today in whatever way you can. in your business, in your place of worship, in the arts, in your schools and cities and counties, and in your state. We need your intelligence and your talents as much today as we ever have before. Great hearts, great lives. Make sure they do not go out, but go on. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Mike Murphy. Quick anecdote. We were talking here a minute ago about rivalries. Charlie mentioned Benjamin Harrison and Theodore Roosevelt. Well, during the Harrison administration, Roosevelt was a civil service commissioner. He made one mistake. He went after one of Benjamin Harrison's best friends in his civil service reform. He tried to prosecute the postmaster of Indianapolis. And so for that sin, Theodore Roosevelt was never invited to the White House during the Benjamin Harrison administration. We're here today to talk about citizenship, and I would hazard to guess that our view of citizenship today is very different than it was during the Civil War. Political people, and there's many here in the room, including one of my mentors in life, John Mutz, our former Lieutenant Governor. I think I saw former Lieutenant Governor Sue Ellspermann here, and Tom Weatherwax, and Peggy Welch, and many others. Political people come into the political business because they want to make a difference. And they each have their own perception of what being not only a good office holder, but a good public citizen means. And I give you a couple examples here today of the different perception, I think, of citizenship prior to the Civil War, during the Civil War. And these were men, primarily white men, who thought of themselves as great leaders and great thinkers. And one of them was related to a guy who served with Tom and I and Peggy, Billy Bright. Billy Bright was from North Vernon, Indiana, and his ancestor, Jesse Bright, was the U.S. Senator from Indiana. At one time, the only U.S. Senator for several years because the legislature couldn't agree on a second senator. So he was the only senator, and he was from Madison, Indiana. He was an amazing guy, probably one of the two most powerful Democrats in the state at the time. A guy named Joseph Wright was probably the other powerful Democrat in the state. And they warred back and forth for patronage control. Well, Jesse Bright, prior to Fort Sumter, several weeks before Fort Sumter, wrote a letter to Jefferson Davis and gave him advice on where to find cheap guns. And here he is, the United States Senator from Indiana. He was put on trial and thrown out of the U.S. Senate. I think the first U.S. Senator ever thrown out of the U.S. Senate. And he went on to live in Kentucky for the rest of his life. James Cravens, who was a congressman from Scott County, the county I focus on, at one point wrote a letter to William English, another Hoosier that I'll talk about in a minute and has a big Indianapolis past as well. And he suggested 3 days before Fort Sumter that southern Indiana, southern Illinois, and southern Ohio be separated out into a new state that would be called Jackson, and it would join the Confederacy. And these guys thought that their role in citizenship was to oppose the continuing attempt to keep the rebellion, or to keep the republic together. Daniel Voorhees, who is now known as the tall sycamore of the Wabash, the congressman from Terre Haute, who eventually became a U.S. Senator. His office in August of 1863 in Terre Haute was raided by federal troops because he was thought to be a gun runner for the Confederates. They didn't find any guns, but they found a letter from a former U.S. Senator from New Jersey telling Voorhees how he could get a hold of 30,000 Garibaldi rifles that he could get to the Confederacy. And then William English himself, who grew up in the same county, the family I'll mention here in a minute, was a famous congressman, well known for his role in the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, and eventually moving here to Indianapolis to start the First National Bank. In 1860, William English, who was known, by the way, as the slaveholders' ally, gave a speech to Congress in which he said, and I'm paraphrasing obviously, in which he said, "I will defend the South's right to a confederacy with the ballot box or with the cartridge box, if necessary." Perry County and Orange County both had referenda and voted to join the Confederacy if Kentucky went. And we had draft officers murdered on the town square in Nashville, Indiana. So those men, they thought they were good citizens. They thought that they were doing the right thing by opposing the preservation of the Republic, or at least opposing the war to preserve the Republic. There was a saying back then among the Peace Democrats that the goal was the Constitution as it is, the Union as it was. And that was kind of their motto during the entire Civil War. Now, the book is titled The Kimberlins Go to War, A Union Family in Copperhead Country. Now, who were the Kimberlins? The Kimberlins were an amazing family in their own right. They came from Hampshire County, Virginia, originally. And one of the Kimberlins, the patriarch John Kimberlin, fought in the Revolutionary War from Bedford, Pennsylvania. But after the Treaty of Grouseland, he brought his older sons down the Ohio River from Pennsylvania, and he bought 500 acres in what is now Scott County. Now, there was 135,000 acres set aside for veterans of George Rogers Clark's Revolutionary War brigades. And John Kimberlin, the patriarch, bought 500 acres from William Harrod, who was a founder of Louisville. And they became, the Kimberlin family, the first settlers of what is now Scott County. They fought at Tippecanoe with William Henry Harrison. They were involved in the Pigeon Roost Massacre in 1812, south of Scottsburg. But by and large, they were a typical Hoosier farm family. They started off, they marched from Madison, Indiana, before there was a Madison, Indiana, by the way. Madison wasn't founded until 1808, and they came in 1805. They marched from the landing near Madison, Indiana, through the woods on a buffalo trace, and they plotted their 500 acres along a spring, along a creek that's now called Kimberlin Creek. They eventually established a tannery, an ale house, a general store, and they were some of the leading citizens of Scott County for many years. Now, Scott County itself kind of swung back and forth. They started off as Jeffersonian Republicans, and they kind of became Jacksonian Democrats, and then generally swung toward the Whigs, and then back in the 1850s swung toward the Democrats again, while Madison remained stoutly Whig and Republican, and Clark County remained stoutly Democrat the whole time. That was the core of the second congressional district. But as the call to war came in 1861, 5 brothers and cousins from the Kimberlin family marched down the road, the Charlestown Road, and went off to war. They joined the 23rd Indiana. In fact, the 2 units I primarily talk about in my book are the 23rd Indiana and the 66th. They didn't fight in Gettysburg. They fought primarily in the Western Theater. The 66th fought at the Battle of Richmond. Their first battle, they were completely wiped out, the Battle of Richmond, Kentucky. I won't get into all the battle history because you can always read about that. But and then the 23rd Indiana fought in the Mississippi campaign, Port Gibson, Raymond, Champion Hill, Vicksburg. In fact, one of the Kimberlins was on the first boat to successfully run the batteries at Vicksburg in early May of 1863. In fact, Peggy's from Mississippi, and Peggy Welch, and I always remind her jokingly that the first flag to fly over the Capitol in Jackson, Mississippi, after we took the city, was the 55th Indiana regimental flag. So the Kimberlins eventually sent 33 men to fight for the Union in the Civil War. 10 of them died, and I am very fortunate to have access to dozens of letters to and from the battlefield that have been preserved until to today. And this book is the first book to actually publish those letters. And they were held by a woman who is still alive, 91 years old, an English teacher from Scottsburg High School, who found the letters when she was a little girl in a barn along with a Civil War uniform. Many years later, she went back. The uniform was gone, but the letters were still there, and she has kept them under her bed ever since. In fact, she was so distrusting of the outside world that I would have to go down on Sunday afternoons. I'd sit next to her. She'd read the old Victorian writing. I would transcribe them into my laptop, and then I would scan them quite selfishly in case Thelma wasn't with us the next Sunday when I came back. But it's an amazing family, and you have to consider that the context of this family sending 33 people to war in the midst of what I call Copperhead country. Literally everything south of Indianapolis was Copperhead country. It's hard to understand right now. And I mentioned some of the views of our politicians. But marriages broke up, churches broke up. There was a young lady named Sarah Bovard Walschmidt, who was a 15-year-old living in Scott County at the time, who wrote a diary. And it's been published, and it's amazing. And my favorite quote from her diary is, on Thanksgiving of 1863, she says, "Mama fixed a turkey for Thanksgiving, won't let anybody but Success eat it." Success was a nickname for secessionists or Copperheads. And so it really did split families. Now, one of the more amazing things we talk about in the book here is the Northwest Conspiracy. And some people know about it, some people don't know anything about it. But there's a doctor from Cincinnati named George Bickley who formed a group called the Knights of the Golden Circle. And the goal of the Knights of the Golden Circle was to capture Indianapolis, Columbus, Ohio, or Chicago, because they all had major Confederate prison camps there. And the goal was to capture the prisoners, arm them, and then take over a Midwestern capital. So the Knights of the Golden Circle, I guess the best way to compare them would be to Masonic lodges of today. Not that Masonic lodges are traitorous or anything, but the kind of the scope and the lodges and the secrecy and the pledges and all that kind of stuff. And they're estimated to have had 125,000 white males in the state of Indiana who belonged to the Knights of the Golden Circle. They were suppressed by Morton and by General Burnside, who was from Liberty, Indiana. And then another group formed called the Order of American Knights. They were short-lived, and then a third group formed with the same goal called the Sons of Liberty, 1864. And eventually, Governor Morton suppressed every group, put some of them on trial. There's a famous case for any lawyers here in the room, Ex parte Milligan, if you study that in law school, where the publisher of the Huntington, Indiana newspaper was shut down because he was considered to be traitorous. He was tried in a military court and sentenced. And then in 1866, the Supreme Court said, sorry, as long as the civilian courts are still in operation, you cannot try a citizen in a military court. Now, that still has ramifications today, because when President Obama tried to close down Guantanamo, one of the things his lawyer said, you can't. Look at Ex parte Milligan in Indiana in 1866. So some of the things that happened during the Civil War are still resonating. Now, one of the more fun parts of the book is, and I'll let you go with this, is that I actually decided to follow the families, the Civil War families after the Civil War, because, as Charlie said, there were Civil War pensions, many of them established by Benjamin Harrison. And you would get $2, $4, $6, $8 a month, and then your descendants could receive that same money. Well, I follow 6 of the folks that fought in the Civil War. Each one is an amazing story. One of them I followed his daughter until 1965. But I'll just tell you one quick vignette. James Harvey Kimberlin, one of the 33 men that went to fight, was a member of the 124th Indiana. He was captured in Spring Hill, Tennessee, as his unit was moving towards Nashville in 1864. He was taken to the Andersonville prison. I don't have to tell you how bad the Andersonville prison was. Tens of thousands of men starved to death there. And after April 1865, he and 459 Hoosiers were put on a train from Andersonville and sent to Jackson, Mississippi. For some reason, they got off the train there and had to walk from Jackson to Vicksburg. I still don't know that reason. But while they're just north of Vicksburg, they get on a steamboat called the Sultana. Well, anybody who knows the Sultana knows it's the worst maritime disaster in American history. They get on the boat, the boilers explode somewhere south of Memphis, and 1,800 American soldiers die either from burns or drowning. James Harvey Kimberlin survived the Andersonville prison and then the Sultana. So he moves here to Indianapolis. He becomes a security guard at the Soldiers and Sailors Monument toward the end of the 19th century. And he's kind of a minor politician. He gets a patronage job, he gets a mailman's job on the train. So he lived out in McCordsville. And he would come down at night, the night before he had to leave on the train, and of course he liked to drink. And one night, it was in 1886, he, as he tells the story in his affidavit, he was at the state Republican headquarters, as he says, watching the election returns come in. Certainly didn't have TV, so I'm not sure what that meant, watching the election returns come in. But it was at Market in Pennsylvania. He comes back to the National Hotel. He gets up sometime during the night, go to the bathroom. And back then, a lot of the windows in these buildings would start at the floor, and you would raise them up from the floor. You could actually step through them. Well, he forgot that he was on the 3rd floor, and he stepped out of the window to relieve himself because he thought he was on the 1st floor, and fell 3 floors on an iron grate, and broke his back and his leg and everything. And they put him on a flat car and took him out to McCordsville and kind of left him out there. Well, he survived that. And during the course of his applications for a Civil War pension, he kept getting turned down. And you can have affidavits that go back and forth and everything. And he kept trying to tell them he was not drinking on election night of 1886. He did not have anything to drink, and it's just that he mixed up being on the 1st floor and the 3rd floor. Well, then in 1914, he's walking in downtown Indianapolis and he gets hit by a car. Now, how many people get hit by a car? How many cars are there in 1914, right, in Indianapolis? He gets hit by a car. Well, so then he keeps going through the process, and finally he gets a letter from Senator Kern, who was a famous Indiana senator at the time, and says, guess what? Your application for a Civil War pension has been approved at $8 a month. But he never gets the money. He's trying to figure it out. What's going on here? Well, he's in another bar in downtown Indianapolis, and he runs into another man whose name is James H. Kimberlin. And it turns out they're second cousins. And they sat there and drank long enough to figure out that the wrong guy got the pension. So James H. got his pension. James Harvey never got his pension. And he died in 1924 having never got his pension. So that's one little vignette from one of the very interesting members of the Kimberlin family. I will let you go. I will tell you that Jay Hine and the Sagamore Institute have been very gracious in purchasing a copy of this book for every one of you here today, if you'd like to take one home with you. And I've tried to write it tightly. It's only like 150 pages. It's not going to take you forever, and hopefully you'll learn something about Indiana during the Civil War. Thanks for having me.
Mike, I've got to say, I want to know what that guy was drinking, because I'd like to have some. You know? Newton Booth Tarkington, a giant of literature in the United States during the 20th century. Tarkington grew up on North Pennsylvania Street here in Indianapolis, went to Shortridge High School, later to Purdue University, where he was a member of Sigma Chi, then to Princeton, and wrote during his career of some 76 years 54 published novels and 3 produced plays. He is truly one of the giants of our literary world in the United States since our founding. He's one of only 3 authors to win 2 Pulitzer Prizes during his career for fiction. He was so prominent that Time magazine put him on the cover and made him Man of the Year in 1924. Tarkington was an individual who believed not just in the importance of literature and writing, but in the importance of government and being a good citizen. He exhibited this by running for the legislature and winning in 1902. He served 1 term in the House. He later was to make many contributions to the universities and colleges that had provided the education for his career. He gave the money for Tarkington Hall, a residential facility on the Purdue campus. Tarkington is probably best known for 2 novels, The Magnificent Ambersons being one of them, and a second, which you probably are familiar with. It was called Alice Adams. Now, both of those books, of course, were made into movies, and the story has been enjoyed by many of us for a long period of time. Tark, as he was called at Princeton, helped found the Princeton Triangle Show. He is, in some circles, given the credit of creating or helping found the Indiana Society of Chicago, which many of you have been a part of. Tarkington also was much more than that. He was a social and political critic. He was in favor of prohibition. Kind of hard to believe an author who didn't drink, but that's the story. He opposed FDR and vehemently opposed the New Deal during his career. Tarkington's work, nearly everything he wrote, was set right here in Indianapolis. where he attended Shortridge High School. And I think about authors from Shortridge High School. Of course, we have some, but he was actually clearly the predominant one. Dan Wakefield being the most recent. But I want to suggest to you that he set his novels in central Indiana. And his commentary in those novels had to do with social conditions and environmental conditions in the state of Indiana. Nobody had heard of an environmentalist in the year 1900, but if we had had that idea, he would have been one, that's for sure. He attributed the problems to the environment largely to one major innovation, the automobile. And he wrote about the foul-smelling exhaust of automobiles that he encountered on North Pennsylvania Street in Indianapolis. He disliked this so badly that he moved to the country, 4270 North Meridian Street, not too far from where we sit today. That home is now occupied by Doris Ann Sadler, a former clerk of the Marion County Court, and well known in local circles here in Indianapolis. Now, when we talk about what he wrote about, he was at one and the same time, he was a member of Indianapolis Society, obviously from an affluent family, well educated, and at the same time, he was a critic of all the things that were making Indianapolis what it was. The economic center of Indiana, and the growth of the automobile industry had a lot to do with the history of Indianapolis. There are some who would suggest that had Tarkington not been so effective with his satire and criticism, that Indianapolis might be the Detroit of today. I'm not too sure whether that's a good thing or not. But I would suggest to you that the novel that I enjoyed the most is not one that most people ever heard of. It's called The Gentleman from Indiana. You can't buy a copy of it now, it's out of print. James Still, the playwright in residence at the IRT, Indiana Repertory Theater here in Indianapolis, adapted that novel, and it was produced as a play. This is a story of a young man who ran a newspaper in a small town outside of Indianapolis, a fictitious town. And he was a civic-minded individual, an individual who wanted to make a difference, and ultimately ran for Congress and was elected to Congress. Now, during the time that he edited the newspaper, he was an outspoken opponent of discrimination against Catholics and Jews and African Americans. And he was in fact attacked by a group of men dressed in white sheets. Now remember, this was long before the Klan was known in Indiana. He calls them whitecaps in the novel. Their problem with society was not with African Americans, but with Catholics and Jews. And so this is a story of what took place later in Indiana, in the days of D.C. Stevenson and others. But Tarkington was one of those individual novelists who maintained access to what I call the collective unconscious. He was able to tap into those things that were developing in society and ultimately would emerge as real in society. A good example was when the editor of the newspaper was injured by the whitecaps. A woman became editor of his newspaper. Now, in that era, that was unheard of. Women weren't supposed to do that sort of thing, nor were they qualified or educated properly and so forth. And so this is a mirror of how he saw things changing in our society. So when I think about Tarkington, and I think about his lifetime full of literature and awards and education, philanthropy, and his ability to be a social critic, I say to myself, if there was ever a Hoosier who deserved to be a Sagamore of the Wabash, he was one. Thank you.